Gone with the Wind. Now, as you can see, this is a very thick book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a whole bunch of mini reviews on each part of the book. So much like how The Lord of the Rings is technically 6 books, this has several parts of it, which makes up the main book. How I came across this one is a rather unique story. This is my mother's favorite book, and also favorite movie. The main reason I know this is because she doesn't read a whole lot outside of the Bible. So the idea that she read through the whole thing shows that she rather enjoyed this book. In fact, before I actually owned this copy, I often joked that this was my mother's At the Shrugged. And you know what? I don't think I'm that far off in that assessment either. I mean, both are pretty thick. In fact, it could be possible that Gone with the Wind is a little thicker. Yeah, they're both about the same size. So before I continue any further with this review, I need to put a very hefty disclaimer. This book takes place during the American Civil War, which has become a time in history that a lot of people are trying to erase, trying to destroy monuments for people to remember it, as well as an overall sentiment to just pretend that it didn't happen. However, I take the Warner Brothers approach to this. I think that pretending a horrible event didn't happen is a lot worse than acknowledging that it did. And on top of that, there is a fair bit to learn about this time in history. But there's a lot more than that, actually. This book deals a lot with slavery taking place in the Deep South in this time period, and many say that slavery is what started the American Civil War in the first place. As such, things might get a little uncomfortable. That is the main thing I want to stress before I move in to the review. So, if I haven't scared you away, if you think you're brave enough for it, let's dive into part 1. The book takes place shortly after Fort Sumter was fired upon. This was the very first skirmish of the Civil War, or at least technically speaking anyway. Most of the men in the Deep South are overjoyed. They wanted to give a reason to finally teach all those Yankees a lesson, as well as just to be able to separate from what would be called the Union, or the United States. What they did instead is they found their own country and named it the Confederacy, with their president, Jefferson Davis. Now, none of this is actually said in the book. This is me just doing my best being a history buff. The very first scene that we open on is a plantation known as Tara, which is in Savannah, Georgia. It is late spring, and even in this early time, the heat of summer is already starting to come into place. In fact, some crops are even starting to bloom, and some are even starting to be harvested. Much like the author herself, I'm getting very off track. So in this plantation are 3 daughters. The oldest is our main character, named Scarlett O'Hara. She lives along with all of the servants, her mother, Ellen, and her father, Gerald, which the book goes into considerable detail as to how these two met, how old they were, as well as just their general disposition. But I'll get to that in a moment. Scarlett is on her front porch talking to the Terrellson twins. Both of them are talking about an up-and-coming barbecue happening, and both of them are rather smitten with Scarlett, and they're asking that she not only eat with them, but also dance with them. She's a little distant with this conversation, but she reluctantly agrees to do both. Just before parting, they drop one vital piece of information. The main reason for this barbecue is because Ashley Wilkes, Scarlett's undying crush, is going to be married to his cousin. It's the Deep South before the Civil War. You can bet your boots that there is going to be a ton of inbreeding at this time. Such news is very devastating to her. And so, instead of waiting inside of the house for supper, she waits outside on the road to be able to maybe get some advice from her father, which, much like most nights, is out drinking and playing cards. However, he's never missed a dinner. He may be a little late, but he always eats his dinner. So she waits by the road, and she tries her best to be a little sneaky with the subject. But in the end, Gerald is able to figure out what exactly is going on and says that you don't want to get involved with Ashley Wilkes. They're a very strange family. His interests are books, and your interests are more of the typical hot-blooded man, hunting, horse riding, gambling, and drinking, and he barely does any of that stuff, although he is good on a horse, apparently. From there, Gerald just considered the conversation over and completely forgets about it. At dinner, they wait, they say the blessing, and then they eat. By the time they finish, Scarlett's mother comes in with her carriage. Once again, Scarlett is rather heartbroken at not only the news, but also Gerald's advice, and she just wants to have the loving aura that Ellen can provide. And so, she is kind of able to get that. However, her two other sisters are also trying to get a piece of the pie as well. As she is getting ready for bed, she starts to formulate a plan as to how in the world she can get Ashley back. The main idea: she's going to wear a rather revealing dress, flirt with everybody as a ways to make Ashley jealous, and then, when the time is right, she is going to tell him about her undying love for him. So while Scarlett is asleep, just a little bit of a background on the other characters. So, Gerald O'Hare, as you might be able to guess from the last name, he is an Irishman. He came off the boat about 20 years ago, and he still carries a bit of that thick Irish accent. Now, this was a bit of a challenge for him trying to get started, as he didn't really have a whole lot of money. In fact, he had to move into his brother's general store in order just to make ends meet. However, Gerald thought he was a lot better than this. And one of the major things he noticed about living in the South for a while is that every man plays cards. And most of them are extremely rich, and they can just drop so much money without noticing. Gerald is a really good card player, and on top of that, he can hold his whiskey. So while the other players are getting a little tipsy, he is still perfectly sober and able to make decisions. And this is how he got his plantation that would later be named Tara, as well as several of his servants. Now, Tara wasn't really all that impressive when he got the place. There was a fire, and just about all that was left was the foundation and a lot of land. However, through help from the general store, he is able to turn it into a bustling cotton plantation. And so from there, he wanted to settle down and have a family. Now, how he met Ellen is a rather curious story. Essentially, he went to the city part of Savannah to try to scope out a potential wife, and that is when he saw her. Now, the main thing to note here is that there's quite a age gap between Gerald and Ellen. Ellen was 16, and Gerald was 30. Now, obviously, the life expectancy was a little shorter, and the idea of 30 is kind of middle age, while 16, I guess, would be prime adulthood at this era, but it's still kind of like, ooh. She was in love with another man. However, he ended up being killed in a barroom brawl. Which, the timing was just perfect for Gerald, because that was the time that he decided to propose marriage to Ellen. Ellen, really seeing no other prospects in life, figured this would be the best way to do it. And so, they got married and shortly started having kids. The other big thing as well is, while there's only 3 sisters, there was actually a family of 6 at one point. There was also 3 brothers, but unfortunately none of them ever really made it past the age of 3, and so both parents had to bury them. After that, they just kind of stopped having kids and started living out their natural lives. And one of the other important aspects to note about this time in history, or at least the way Margaret explains this time in history, is that there's a lot of rules and regulations, a lot of decorum. The idea that a family name is something that is very important. People want to know what the great-grandfather did, and then they judge the rest of the family accordingly. And on top of that, the siblings that are born have the very hefty responsibility of not shaming the family. This, in a ways, reminds me a bit of Wuthering Heights, and just like when I read that book, I have a very hard time connecting to that. I was, well, still am, lower middle class, if that's even a thing anymore. So, not having to keep up appearances is not really a whole lot I can relate to. I will admit there was a little bit of a fear because I didn't want my parents to get angry at me or anything. But the idea of having to keep the family name as well as not shaming the entire family, that is completely lost on me. So, Scarlet wakes up the next day and then attempts to put her plan into action. For the most part, it seems to be going all right. However, one of the people at this party, Charles is his name, is really taking a fancy to her, even though she's just using him to try to get Ashley jealous. Which, that plan backfires because he doesn't really care. All he's really been doing is checking out after his future wife. So Scarlet moves into plan B. Because this is a long party, it's typical that there's bound to be a midday rest. It was during this time, most of the girls would be upstairs, while all the guys would be outside on the porch smoking, drinking, and talking about the prospects of a future war. Scarlet saw this as her opportunity to be able to talk to Ashley alone. So, both of them meet up in the library when Scarlet straight up professes her love, which the book makes sure to painstakingly state that this is not how a lady is supposed to do things. Ladies are supposed to be subtle. They can't be direct. So the idea of doing this is a bit of social suicide. However, Ashley just kind of takes it as playful banter, but after a while, she does convince Ashley that her feelings are true. And then, just like Gerald the night before, tries to convince Scarlet that their marriage would just simply not be compatible. They are two very different people. However, Scarlet isn't having it, and eventually bursts out, almost wanting to kill him because he said he loved him. In fact, she feels that he led her on to the idea of getting married through past conversations. And she's like, where is all this coming from? This doesn't make any sense. You said you loved me, right? Ashley leaves the library, leaving Scarlet being an overboiling tea kettle. She takes a nearby candy dish and then hurls it as hard as she can against the wall. However, to her dismay, she finds out she is not the only one in the room. In the room is so far my favorite characters, Rhett Butler. Now, he was described a little bit before this scene. He's not necessarily somebody that people want to be around. He is not received, as it is called. And the main reason for this becomes very apparent before a conversation before the library. He is a very direct person. He doesn't keep up with all this decorum stuff that most other deep Southerners would do. He just tells it like it is. And then if he realizes that what he said is controversial, he leaves without fear of making anything worse. He basically just says, whoa, honey, you completely committed social suicide over this. There's no way anybody is going to let you live this down. And that right there is when Scarlet says, how dare you eavesdrop on me? You are no gentleman. To which he replies, and you are not a lady. Which to me sets up a little understanding. Now, I've seen the movies, so I kind of have a general idea of where this is going to go. But I find that setup very brilliant. In order for Scarlet to save face, to marry Charles, as a way to get revenge against Ashley. Of course, even though she has only feelings of hate for him, there's still kind of this overburning love just under the surface. They get married about 2 weeks later, and that is when the war officially breaks out. Charles, like most of the other men in the area, wanted to go off and fight in the war. Ashley included. This turns out to be a bit of a blessing as well as a curse, because Charles ends up dying from this. Not on the battlefield in glory like he was hoping, but just from pure sickness and trying to get to the camp. However, before he left, he impregnated Scarlett, who, should I just mention, is also 16 at this time. I'm happy that they completely cut this part from the movie because it just feels so wrong. And on top of that, in the context of the book, it's a little confusing because on their honeymoon, Scarlett refused to have Charles sleep in the same bed as her. And only on the second night did she kind of let him in the bed with her. But all the same, keeping up this appearance of, do not touch me, I'm just doing this so that my entire family isn't going to be shamed because I did something that most people would see as stupid. Yet somehow she was fine with him having sex with her. So it might seem like she's free. But in addition to being just stuck with the child, she is stuck in mourning, which, according to the statutes of this area, means that she can't even look at a guy or just even have a smile on her face for the next 3 years. And the whole time she has to be draped from head to toe in pure black. So obviously, she's depressed. She knows that she made an awful mistake marrying Charles. But the way it was described, it almost seemed like that was the bit of a lesser of two evils. But the idea of her being pregnant and basically being off the table for anyone to potentially date, that seems like a pretty bad prospect as well. A lot of people pin her depression just on Charles's death. And a lot of people even say that, hey, it's a good thing that she has a child, so it's a way of her being able to remember it. But Scarlett cannot understand how people would see her getting any joy out of this child whatsoever, or the idea that she's depressed that Charles is dead. She is still pining for Ashley, and on top of that, just wants to be able to be herself again, to be free, not to be bogged down with the idea of a child and just being a nun for the next 3 years. So the family notices that she's getting depressed, and the local doctor suggests that she get a change of scenery. So she goes to other relatives, but they just bring her down just as much, as all they do is remind her of how horrible her life is. She goes back to Tara, and there she receives an invitation from her sister-in-law, which, if you want really complicated, the sister-in-law is the one that married Ashley. So there was a little bit of a sting there, but Scarlett is just at her end and figures, what has she got to lose? And so they were going off to the city of Atlanta. And that is the end of part 1.